I'm taking 5 of America's most loved recipes and making them with my own lamb, born and raised on my back pasture. Homesteaders on small acreage are increasingly opting for lamb as a way to raise red meat, and with the price of beef cattle shooting through the roof, the idea is only becoming more appealing. Sheep are prolific, fast-growing, and grow fat on pasture that would starve a cow. However, a common question that comes through is, how do you cook it? And my answer is, I substitute it for beef in most any recipe. Today is a practical look at exactly how that works, including a few simple cooking hacks that make my lamb dishes taste less lamby in order to please the lamb skeptics that are still in my house. Now I have a free PDF cookbook with all of the upcoming recipes and cooking tips. You can download it for free using the link in the description of this video. The first recipe is the Oklahoma fried onion smash burger, my personal favorite. Ingredients include ground lamb, yellow onions, cheese, and French onion special sauce. The burgers are typically made with an 80-20 ground beef. I used my pasture-raised ground lamb, which is much more lean than the 80-20. To make up for that, I mixed grass-fed beef tallow into that ground lamb. Now, in addition to adding the fat necessary, this gives the burgers a more traditionally beefy flavor. I sliced the onions thin, then salted them and set them aside in a strainer for 45 minutes. While I was waiting, I mixed up the special sauce, which involves the use of Worcestershire sauce, mustard, and a less than healthy French onion chip dip. You can skip that unhealthy mix if you want, but for me personally, I opt for an 80-20 rule in my diet. Now it's time for the fun part. I added more beef tallow to the pan for frying, smashed an equal amount of onions and lamb, toasting the bun while I was at it, and voila. Now I was going to get one of those cheesy tasting videos, but the burgers were totally devoured before I could film it. These are definitely a crowd favorite. Recipe number 2 is hands down the easiest way to cook lamb and will rival any beef, brisket, or pulled pork. I started with a crock pot and put my lamb shoulder and shank directly in. Now you can start with frozen or thawed meat. I then sprinkled it with salt, pepper, paprika, and garlic. I rough chopped 2 yellow onions and added them directly on top. I finished off by adding 1 cup of water. You need to add 2 cups if you're cooking the meat from frozen. And then I set it to slow cook in the crock pot for 3 to 4 hours or until fork tender. At this point, the meat falls right off the bones. I removed the bones, saved some onions, mixed in my favorite barbecue sauce. At this point, you can add it to a toasted bun or loaded baked potato or both for a crowd-pleasing meal. Now, I often hear complaints about the flavor of lamb, and something I should add here is that I raise Dorper sheep, which are a hair sheep. Hair sheep grow hair like a goat, rather than wool like your traditional woolly back sheep. Now, this makes a difference because much of the strong flavor that Americans complain about when it comes to lamb comes off the lanolin, an oil produced and harbored in the sheep's wool. With my hair sheep, the lamby flavor is exceptionally mild, and cooking with garlic and onions softens that flavor even more. Now, recipe number 3 is Birria tacos. This was my first time making this famous recipe, and it had me really nervous with all the spices. Now, in the States, these tacos are made with beef roast and ribs. However, these traditional Mexican tacos would have originally been made with lamb or goat. There are a whopping 14 different spices and peppers, which, like I said, made me really nervous, but I just went with it. In place of the beef chuck roast and ribs, I used lamb shoulder and neck roast. Now, the meat was supposed to be cubed, but after wrestling with the bone-in lamb cuts for several minutes, I left the meat on the bone and just hoped for the best. I created a rub for the meat by combining salt, garlic powder, smoked paprika, and mesquite seasoning. While that meat rested, I prepped the mole sauce, which involved boiling 4 different types of chilies, seeded and stemmed, I was nervous, alongside onion, garlic, tomatoes, and bay leaves until soft. While they boiled, I returned to the meat and seared it for 3 minutes on each side. Then I placed it in a Dutch oven. By this time, the peppers were soft, and I drained and added them to a blender with a whopping 10 more spices, becoming even more nervous with each spice. Now, on top of the spices went beef broth, apple cider vinegar, and as a side note, if you're using one of those blenders from the 1980s, make sure you screw it on right so it doesn't bleed all over the countertop. Now, I blended the mole sauce and was seriously becoming convinced that this dish was out to get me because, at this point, the entire blend of 14 spices and peppers hit me in the eyeball on its way out of the blender. Now, once the mole sauce is blended, pour it over the meat with the remainder of the beef stock and let them cook together for 3 hours at 350 degrees. While these cooked, I prepped my favorite part of the dish, which was the cheese, and I used 2 types of cheese, a Mexican queso and a Monterey Jack. After 3 hours, I removed the meat from the oven and was majorly satisfied to find that the lamb shredded right off the bone. I did not ruin the recipe by failing to cube that meat. I did remove the bones and stringy, tendony leftovers from the shoulder and neck. I separated all the meat from the mole sauce, and then it was time to bring the complete picture together. Using these adorable mini tortillas, I started cooking up the finished tacos. I heated and oiled my pan, dipped both sides of the tortilla in the mole sauce, added the shredded meat, cheese, more cheese, and fried both sides. Now at this point, my skepticism was turning to optimism. The cloves and peppers were coming together to create this really sweet and spicy and delicious smell. And once I had a decent sized pile of these tiny tacos, I spent a few minutes alone with them before my family came in. Now the cheese pull on these little guys was impressive, and after one bite, I was blown away. Sweet, rich, spicy, but with really no lingering spicy burn. I ate a whole one, then I said, well, let's eat another one. And then I parted with the rest, which my family ate really fast. Now dish number 4 is the shepherdess rendition of the chicken so famous it broke the internet. The original recipe is called Marry Me Chicken and involves breaded pieces of meat drenched in a garlicky cream sauce, sure to conjure up lots of proposals for any single girl out there. Now I up-leveled this recipe by replacing the chicken with a lamb tenderloin, doubling the sauce, and adding angel hair pasta to make it a pasta dish. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The recipe starts by you tenderizing chicken breasts with a meat mallet, but since the tenderloin was bone-in, I instead marinated it in orange juice overnight, which softened the meat up perfectly without having to take a meat mallet to it. I then created a breading mix with all of the spices and the flour. Then I breaded the tenderloin and let them rest. Now make sure you save the leftover breading mix for later. While the chops rested, I heated the skillet, added angel hair pasta to boiling water and a little bit of oil, then I pan-seared the loin chops. I wanted the lamb loin to remain pink on the inside, so I only let them sear for about 2 minutes on each side. Keep in mind, they'll cook a little more later. Now once seared, I set the loin chops aside in a warm place and started mixing up a double portion of the cream sauce. I added the butter and oil, the leftover flour mix from breading, and I let them brown with the garlic for about 1 minute. I then added the sun-dried tomatoes, letting the whole thing sizzle for 3 more minutes. Then I finished the cream sauce by adding my beef broth, cream, and milk, as well as the Parmesan cheese, letting it simmer on low until it was delightfully thick. I added the loin chops back into that sauce for just 3 minutes, removing them only to add my pasta. Then I placed them back on top of the finished dish. Now I taste tested this and it made me cry a little bit. Maybe because it was so good, maybe because I had been cooking all day at this point, I don't know. But either way, it was so creamy and the loin chops were still perfectly pink on the inside, which I considered a major win. Now my last of 5 dishes was a loaded breakfast omelet that I made with all of the leftovers. But every good breakfast starts with biscuits, so I mixed up a batch of those. While they baked, I heated and oiled my pan, then scrambled 2 eggs for the omelet, thanks to my sister, the chicken lady, who had just brought in the daily bounty from her chickens. I loaded the omelet with caramelized onions, which were left over from the burger, queso cheese, which were left over from my tacos, and shredded lamb. Now you can either use the barbecue leftovers or the taco leftover. Whichever you have, either one works great. And as you probably guessed from this shot, the omelet did not disappoint me. Now remember that all of these recipes are available in my free cookbook you can download using the first link in the description of this video. Thanks guys for watching, and make sure to give it a thumbs up before you head out. And watch this video next for a step-by-step on how to make cheese using sheep milk.